A carpenter's son walks into the largest megachurch in America. The sanctuary gleams with marble floors, crystal chandeliers worth more than most homes, and a golden altar that could feed a small village for months. As he watches congregants drop $100 bills into collection plates, while homeless veterans shiver outside in the parking lot, his heart breaks. Not from physical pain, but from something far deeper, the realization that his name is being used to justify the very things he spent his life opposing. This isn't fiction. This is the story of how a movement built on radical love, sacrifice, and service to the marginalized became something its founder would barely recognize. In the year 30 CE, a Jewish preacher named Yeshua of Nazareth delivered what would become known as the Sermon on the Mount. Standing on a hillside overlooking the Sea of Galilee, he spoke words that would echo through 2 millennia. "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth." These weren't just pretty words meant for Sunday morning recitation. They were revolutionary statements that turned the Roman world's values upside down. In an empire where strength meant domination, wealth meant divine favor, and power meant everything, Jesus preached a gospel of weakness, poverty, and servitude. But somewhere between that dusty hillside and the air-conditioned sanctuaries of modern America, something went terribly wrong. The prosperity gospel industry in the United States generates over $700 million annually. Television preachers promise viewers that faith can be measured in bank account balances, that God wants them to be wealthy, and that poverty is a sign of insufficient belief. Joel Osteen's net worth exceeds $100 million. Kenneth Copeland owns multiple private jets, justifying them by claiming he needs to avoid demonic crowds at commercial airports. Creflo Dollar, yes, that's his real name, asked his congregation to fund a $65 million private jet. Meanwhile, Jesus of Nazareth owned so little that when he died, Roman soldiers gambled for his only possession of value, his robe. The Gospels record that he had nowhere to lay his head. He told his followers to sell their possessions and give to the poor. He said it would be easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter heaven. The disconnect isn't subtle, it's staggering. In first-century Palestine, Jesus spent his time with tax collectors, prostitutes, lepers, and foreigners, the people respectable society rejected. He touched untouchables, ate with outcasts, and defended those others condemned. When religious leaders brought him a woman caught in adultery, expecting him to approve her stoning, he instead challenged her accusers. "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone." Fast forward to modern America, where some of the loudest voices claiming to represent Jesus spend their platforms condemning LGBT+ individuals, immigrants, and anyone who doesn't fit their narrow definition of righteousness. In 2019, prominent evangelical leader Franklin Graham declared that God's judgment would fall on America because of its acceptance of homosexuality. Yet the same Jesus who supposedly inspires such proclamations saved his harshest criticism not for sexual sinners but for religious hypocrites. The Pharisees of Jesus' time were the prosperity preachers of their era, religious leaders who paraded their piety while exploiting the faithful. Jesus called them whitewashed tombs, beautiful on the outside but full of dead bones within. He accused them of making religion a burden rather than a blessing, of caring more about their reputation than about people's suffering. Sound familiar? In 70 CE, Jerusalem fell to Roman legions. The temple was destroyed, its treasures looted, and over 1 million Jews were killed or enslaved. Early Christians saw this as validation of Jesus' prophecy that God's judgment would fall on those who oppressed the poor and marginalized in religion's name. They believed their movement represented something entirely different, a community where there was no needy person among them, where members sold their possessions to care for each other, where social status meant nothing. These early Christians were so committed to economic equality that the book of Acts records, all the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. When a couple named Ananias and Sapphira lied about donating their full proceeds from a land sale while keeping some for themselves, they literally dropped dead. The message was clear: greed and deceit had no place in Christ's community. Contrast this with modern American Christianity, where wealth is often seen as a sign of God's blessing rather than a responsibility to share. The average American pastor's salary has increased by 57% since 2000, while giving to programs for the poor has decreased. Megachurches spend more on building maintenance than many denominations spend on global missions. But the transformation didn't happen overnight. It began in the 4th century when Emperor Constantine made Christianity the official religion of Rome. Suddenly, the persecuted became the privileged. The faith of slaves and outcasts became the religion of emperors and elites. Churches went from meeting in homes to erecting massive basilicas. Bishops went from risking their lives to wielding political power. This shift fundamentally changed Christianity's character. What began as a grassroots movement of social revolutionaries became an institution of social control. The religion that proclaimed "the last shall be first" became a tool for keeping the last in their place. By the time Christianity reached America, it carried centuries of institutional baggage. The Puritans brought a work ethic that gradually morphed into the prosperity gospel. The frontier spirit created an individualistic faith that contrasted sharply with Jesus' communal vision. The American dream became conflated with God's will. Then came the 20th century's most devastating development: the marriage of Christianity and political power. In 1979, Jerry Falwell founded the Moral Majority, explicitly linking Christian faith with conservative politics. For the first time in American history, being a faithful Christian became synonymous with supporting specific political candidates and policies. Jesus, meanwhile, had explicitly rejected political power. When Satan offered him dominion over all earthly kingdoms, he refused. When crowds tried to make him king, he fled. When asked about paying taxes to Rome, he said, "Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and unto God what is God's." A clear separation of spiritual and political authority. The man who said, "My kingdom is not of this world," would be bewildered by Christians who believe their primary mission is to legislate morality and control government policy. Hey, quick question before we dive deeper. Where are you watching from right now, and what time is it there? I love connecting with Professor Archive viewers from around the world. Drop your location and time in the comments below. And if you're finding this exploration eye-opening, consider leaving a super thanks to help keep these deep dives coming. Your support means everything to independent research and storytelling. Now, back to our story of transformation and heartbreak. Perhaps nowhere is the contrast more stark than in Christianity's approach to money and materialism. Jesus told one potential follower to sell everything and give it to the poor. He said you cannot serve both God and money. He praised a poor widow who gave her last 2 coins more than rich donors, who gave larger amounts but kept even more for themselves. The early church took these teachings seriously. Church Father John Chrysostom wrote in the 4th century, "Not to enable the poor to share in our goods is to steal from them and deprive them of life." Another early Christian leader, Basil the Great, declared, "The bread in your cupboard belongs to the hungry man. The coat hanging unused in your closet belongs to one who needs it." These weren't fringe voices, they were mainstream Christian teaching for centuries. Today, the average American Christian household gives less than 3% of their income to charity of any kind, while spending 12% on entertainment and recreation. American churches collectively own assets worth over $600 billion, yet 38 million Americans live in poverty. The cognitive dissonance would likely drive Jesus to overturn more than just money changers' tables. But perhaps the most heartbreaking departure involves Jesus' core message of love, particularly love for enemies. In the Sermon on the Mount, he commanded, "Love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use and persecute you." When Peter drew a sword to defend him, Jesus said, "Put your sword back in its place, for all who draw the sword will die by the sword." Yet American Christianity has often blessed warfare, particularly when conducted in Christianity's name. The Crusades claimed to fight for Christ while slaughtering Muslims and Jews. European colonizers claimed divine mandate while enslaving Africans. American settlers claimed God's blessing while committing genocide against Native Americans. Even today, white evangelicals are statistically more likely to support military intervention than any other religious group. They're also more likely to oppose refugee assistance, despite Jesus' explicit command to welcome the stranger. When thousands of Central American families fled violence and poverty in 2018, seeking asylum at the U.S. border, many prominent Christian leaders supported policies that separated children from their parents. The same Christ who said, "Whoever welcomes a little child in my name welcomes me." The historical Jesus was himself a refugee. When King Herod ordered the massacre of infants in Bethlehem, Mary and Joseph fled with baby Jesus to Egypt, seeking asylum from political persecution. Today's immigration policies would likely turn the Holy Family away at the border. This disconnect extends to racial justice, an issue that reveals the depth of American Christianity's theological drift. Jesus' genealogy deliberately includes non-Jews: Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba, women who were foreigners, outcasts, or victims of sexual exploitation. His ministry consistently broke down ethnic and social barriers. He praised the faith of Roman centurions, healed Samaritan lepers, and commanded his followers to make disciples of all nations. Yet American Christianity provided theological justification for slavery, segregation, and ongoing racial inequality. In 1845, Southern Baptists split from their Northern counterparts specifically to defend slavery. Many white churches remained segregated until the 1970s, and some informal segregation persists today. Sunday morning remains the most segregated hour in America. When Martin Luther King Jr. led the civil rights movement, he found his strongest opposition not from secular sources, but from white Christian leaders who accused him of being too radical, too impatient, too disruptive of social order. In his famous letter from Birmingham jail, King wrote, "I have been so greatly disappointed with the white church and its leadership. When I was suddenly catapulted into the leadership of the bus protest in Montgomery, Alabama, a few years ago, I felt we would be supported by the white church. I felt that the white ministers, priests, and rabbis of the South would be among our strongest allies. Instead, some have been outright opponents." The irony is devastating. The movement most aligned with Jesus' teachings, nonviolent resistance to oppression, love for enemies, sacrifice for justice, was opposed by those who claimed to follow Jesus most closely. This pattern repeats throughout American history. Abolitionists found their strongest opposition in churches that defended slavery using biblical interpretation. Women seeking the right to vote faced resistance from ministers who claimed female submission was God's will. Workers organizing for fair wages were told that their poverty was divinely ordained, and their protests violated biblical teaching about submitting to authority. Yet Jesus himself was executed as a political subversive. Roman authorities didn't crucify him for teaching about love and forgiveness. They crucified him because his message threatened the social order. His proclamation that the last shall be first implied that the first would be last. His healing on the Sabbath challenged religious authority. His cleansing of the temple confronted economic exploitation. The historical evidence suggests Jesus was far more radical than modern American Christianity acknowledges. Scholar John Dominic Crossan argues that Jesus' core message was about social and economic transformation, not just personal salvation. The kingdom of heaven wasn't primarily about life after death. It was about God's justice breaking into the present world. This interpretation explains why early Christians were persecuted. If Christianity were merely about personal piety and eternal reward, Roman authorities wouldn't have cared. But a movement that proclaimed economic equality, challenged social hierarchies, and offered dignity to slaves and women posed a genuine threat to imperial power. That radical edge has been systematically dulled in American Christianity. The faith that once challenged empire now blesses it. The movement that proclaimed good news to the poor now often blames poverty on moral failure. The religion that welcomed outcasts now frequently excludes those who don't conform to cultural expectations. Consider how Jesus would view modern worship practices. He taught his followers to pray in private, warning against those who love to pray, standing in the synagogues and on the street corners to be seen by others. Yet prosperity preachers broadcast their prayers to millions, often asking for money during their spiritual appeals. Jesus warned against calling anyone father or teacher in religious contexts because you have one Father and He is in heaven. Yet American Christianity has created elaborate hierarchies with titles, robes, and ceremonies that would make Roman emperors envious. Jesus said his followers would be known by their love for one another. A 2007 study by the Barna Group found that among Americans aged 16-29, the most common perception of Christianity was hypocritical, followed by too focused on getting converts and anti-homosexual. Only 16% saw Christianity as love-centered. The data tells a heartbreaking story. Young Americans increasingly view Christianity not as good news but as judgment, not as love but as hostility, not as hope but as hypocrisy. They're not rejecting Jesus. They're rejecting what American Christianity has made of Jesus. Meanwhile, the fastest-growing religious category in America is nones, people who claim no religious affiliation. Many cite Christian hypocrisy as their primary reason for leaving faith behind. They've encountered a version of Christianity so distant from its founders' teachings that they can't reconcile the two. But perhaps most tragic is how this distortion affects those who remain. Millions of sincere believers struggle with cognitive dissonance, sensing something wrong but unable to name it. They read Jesus' words about loving enemies while hearing sermons about spiritual warfare. They study his teachings on economic justice while tithing to build bigger sanctuaries. They follow a Savior who embraced outcasts while attending churches that turn away the different. The psychological toll is measurable. Studies show higher rates of depression and anxiety among Christians who attend churches emphasizing prosperity theology or political activism compared to those focused on community service and spiritual formation. The promise of abundant life becomes a source of guilt and confusion when reality doesn't match expectation. Yet the story isn't entirely dark. Throughout American history, Christian voices have also led movements for justice and reform. The Underground Railroad was largely organized by Christian abolitionists. The social gospel movement of the early 1900s fought for workers' rights and urban reform. The civil rights movement was deeply rooted in Black church tradition. Today, many Christians work quietly but persistently for racial reconciliation, economic justice, and environmental stewardship. These believers represent Christianity's authentic core, the radical love that transforms individuals and societies. They follow a Jesus who comforts the disturbed and disturbs the comfortable, who afflicts the powerful and empowers the afflicted. Their existence proves that another way is possible. American Christianity could return to its roots, could rediscover the revolutionary vision that turned the ancient world upside down. It would require abandoning the pursuit of wealth, power, and respectability that Jesus explicitly rejected. It would mean embracing the marginalized people Jesus prioritized. It would involve uncomfortable conversations about privilege, injustice, and complicity. Most challenging of all, it would require admitting that much of what passes for Christianity in America would be unrecognizable to its founder. The carpenter's son who preached on that hillside 2,000 years ago offered a vision of human community that still takes the breath away. A world where love conquers hate, where justice flows like water, where the powerful serve the powerless, where enemies become friends, where abundance is shared rather than hoarded. That vision hasn't died. It lives in soup kitchens and homeless shelters, in churches that welcome everyone regardless of their past, in believers who choose compassion over judgment, service over success, love over law. But for that vision to flourish, American Christianity must choose. Will it continue down the path of wealth, power, and cultural dominance that Jesus rejected? Or will it return to the radical love that cost him everything? The choice will determine not just Christianity's future, but America's soul. Because the questions Jesus posed remain as urgent today as they were 2 millennia ago. What does it profit someone to gain the whole world but lose their soul? Who is my neighbor? What does love look like in action? His heart breaks not because his followers have failed to be perfect, but because they've stopped trying to be faithful. The gap between profession and practice, between Sunday sermons and Monday choices, between stated beliefs and actual behavior, that gap would grieve the one who said, "Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not do what I say?" Perhaps that grief is where healing begins, in recognizing the distance between Christ's teachings and American Christianity's practice, in acknowledging how far the movement has drifted from its radical roots, in choosing, moment by moment, to follow the narrow path of authentic discipleship rather than the broad road of cultural Christianity. The carpenter's son is still walking among us, still calling disciples, still offering the same revolutionary vision of love that changed the world once before. The question isn't whether he would be heartbroken by what Christianity has become. The question is whether his heartbreak will finally break our hearts enough to change. The choice, as always, is ours.